Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the Faculty of Women and the Department of English, Languages, and Literature for putting together the conference amidst of these challenging times. Today, I'll talk about my paper, Canon to Code, AI as Mediator of Knowledge in Language and Literary Pedagogy. A few weeks ago, I was reading Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. And before I read it myself, I asked an AI system to interpret it. And within seconds, it told me the tone, the themes, and what the poem meant. It was very clear, structured, and it sounded confident. And then I realized that I hadn't actually read the poem yet. That moment raised a question. If interpretation is already given to us, what happens to the process of reading? In literary studies, knowledge has traditionally been understood as the outcome of a dynamic and interpretive process. Meaning does not reside inherently within the text. Rather, it emerges through an interplay between text, reader, and interpreter. Within this framework, ambiguity, multiplicity, and contestation are not obstacles to understanding. They are essential conditions of literary engagement. However, what we are witnessing today is a significant transformation in this structure. Artificial intelligence no longer simply assists reading, it increasingly mediates interpretation itself. By generating summaries and analysis that often precede direct engagement with texts, AI begins to occupy the space between the text and the reader. In this paper, I explore that AI should be understood not merely as a tool, but as a mediator of literary meaning. And more specifically, I argue that we are witnessing a shift in what we call knowledge leadership from human dialogic processes toward increasingly mediated algorithmic forms of authority. What I want to examine today is what this shift means, not only for how we interpret literature, but for how literary knowledge itself is produced, taught, and understood. To understand what is changing, we first need to ask a more fundamental question. Who has traditionally led literary knowledge? In literary studies, knowledge has never been produced by a single authority. Instead, it has emerged through a network of actors, authors, critics, and educators, each playing a distinct but interconnected role. Authors produce texts, but they do not fix meaning. Critics interpret those texts, often in competing ways, and educators mediate these interpretations, guiding readers within an institutional framework. What is important here is that authority is not centralized, it is distributed. Meaning is not decided once and for all at the moment of writing. Instead, it is continuously reconstituted through interpretation, through dialogue, and through disagreement. In fact, disagreement is not a problem in literary studies. It is essential. Competing interpretations coexist. Different readings highlight different aspects of the text. And it is precisely this openness, this multiplicity, that gives literary knowledge its depth and richness. Pedagogically, this structure plays a crucial role. Readers are not simply expected to receive meaning, they are expected to participate in its construction. Students learn to engage with ambiguity, to build arguments from textual evidence, and to revise their interpretations in response to new insights. In this sense, literary education is not just about understanding texts, it is about cultivating critical thinking through interpretation. However, this structure is now beginning to change. With the rise of AI, a new actor has entered this interpretive ecosystem. AI systems do not simply contribute to interpretation in the way critics or educators do. Instead, they increasingly pre-structure it. When readers encounter texts today, they often do so through AI-generated summaries, explanations, or analysis, sometimes even before they engage with the text itself. This introduces a subtle but significant shift. Instead of meaning emerging through dialogue and interpretation, it is increasingly delivered in advance. Instead of readers constructing meaning, they are often encountering it as already organized and resolved. So the question is no longer simply who produces literary knowledge, but how authority itself is being restructured when interpretation is mediated by computational systems. The next point I want to emphasize is the literary meaning is not immediate. This is one of the foundational assumptions of literary studies. Unlike informational or purely functional texts, literary works do not simply deliver meaning in a transparent way. They resist singular or definitive readings. Literary texts are shaped by ambiguity, figurative language, tonal shifts, symbolism, and open-ended structures that invite multiple interpretations. So when we read literature, we are not simply retrieving meaning from the page, we are constructing it. Meaning does not reside solely within the text, nor is it passively received by the reader. Rather, it emerges through engagement, through movement between textual detail and interpretive reflection. This means that interpretation is active, not passive. It requires attention, patience, and often uncertainty. In this practice, this process is dynamic and iterative. Readers move between elements such as form, tone, imagery, rhythm, structure, and voice, and then relate these features to broader thematic or conceptual frameworks. So interpretation is not simply about asking, what does this text mean? It is also about asking, how is meaning being produced here? How does the tone evolve? How does repetition shape emphasis? How does the form contribute to the argument or feeling of the poem, for example? This is why close reading has historically been so central to literary pedagogy. Close reading asks students to remain with the text, to attend carefully to its details rather than rushing toward a conclusion. It encourages readers to trace how meaning unfolds rather than assuming that meaning is already obvious. In this sense, literary interpretation is not simply a matter of identifying a hidden message, it is a method of thinking, and ambiguity is crucial here in literary studies. Ambiguity is not just tolerated, it is productive. It creates space for interpretive plurality. Different readers may emphasize different images, different tonal movements, different symbolic associations, and in doing so, they may produce different but equally compelling readings. So multiplicity is not a weakness of literary interpretation, it is one of its defining strengths. This is also why literary study has such a pedagogical value. When students engage with a literary text, they are not only learning about that text, they are learning how to interpret, how to build an argument, how to support a claim with evidence, how to remain open to revision, and how to inhibit uncertainty without immediately collapsing it into certainty. In other words, literary education cultivates critical thinking not just through content, but through interpretive practice. Another important point is that interpretation is temporarily extended. Meaning unfolds over time. It develops through reading, rereading, reflection, discussion, and sometimes disagreement with peers. It is shaped by prior knowledge, interpretive communities, and changing perspectives. So literary understanding is not a single moment of recognition. It is a gradual intellectual and affective process. And this is precisely why AI matters so much in this context. If literary meaning has traditionally depended on ambiguity, delay, interpretive effort, an openness to multiple possibilities, then any system that presents meaning as immediate, stable, and complete is not simply helping readers read faster, it is altering the epistemic structure of literary knowledge itself. So before we even ask whether AI interpretations are good or bad, we need to recognize something more foundational. They intervene in a field where meaning has historically been understood as process, not product. So far, we've described literary meaning as something that emerges through process, through ambiguity, engagement, and interpretation. The question now is, what happens when artificial intelligence enters this space? What we are witnessing is not simply the addition of a new tool, it is a shift in the structure of interpretation itself. Artificial intelligence does not just support reading, it increasingly anticipates and pre-structures interpretation. Today, AI systems can generate summaries, thematic analysis, tonal descriptions, and even evaluate interpretations of literary texts within seconds. And importantly, these outputs are often encountered before or alongside the act of reading itself. So the reader's first engagement with the text is no longer necessarily with the text itself, but with an interpretation of that text. This changes the position of the reader in a significant way. Traditionally, the reader encounters the text and constructs meaning through engagement. Now, the reader increasingly encounters meaning as something already organized, ready-made, already structured, before that engagement even begins. In this sense, AI begins to occupy a new position within the interpretive ecosystem. It functions as an intermediary between the text and the reader. Interpretation is no longer only something the reader does, it is something that is presented to the reader, and this has important consequences. Interpretation, which was previously a temporal process, something that unfolded over time through reading, reflection, and dialogue, becomes increasingly immediate and outcome oriented. The delay, the uncertainty, the movement through ambiguity, these are compressed into a final answer. AI generated interpretations tend to prioritize clarity, coherence, and completeness. They present meaning as structured and resolved, but in doing so, they often minimize ambiguity and exclude alternative readings. And perhaps most important thing to think about is the reasoning behind these interpretations is largely invisible. Unlike pedagogical or scholarly interpretations, which show how meaning is constructed or debated, AI outputs present conclusions without exposing the process that led to them. The interpretive work is hidden. So what we are seeing is not the disappearance of interpretation, but its reconfiguration. Interpretation shifts from something that is constructed through engagement to something that is encountered as a finished product. Interpretation moves from process to pre-structured output, and to fully understand what this means, we really need to think about how interpretation is tied to authority, which is where theoretical frameworks become valuable. So one way to think about this comes from Foucault, who argues that knowledge is inseparable from power. Those who interpret, classify, and organize knowledge are not just describing reality, they are shaping what counts as legitimate knowledge. Critics, scholars, and educators do not simply explain texts, they participate in producing literary meaning. They decide which interpretations are taken seriously, which frameworks are valid, and which readings become dominant. At the same time, Roland Barthes complicates this structure. In his essay, The Death of the Author, Barthes argues that meaning does not originate from the author's intention. Instead, it emerges through the interaction between text and reader. This shifts authority away from the author and distributes it across interpretation. Meaning becomes multiple, open, and contingent. The reader becomes an active participant in meaning making. Now, when we introduce AI into this framework, something else happens. On one hand, AI seems to extend Barthes' idea. It further distances meaning from the author. But on the other hand, it reintroduces a new form of centralized authority, and this authority does not belong to the author. It does not fully belong to the reader either. Instead, it resides in the system that generates interpretation. AI produces outputs that appear generalized, coherent, and authoritative without being situated within a particular interpretive perspective. To describe this, I introduce the concept of mediated knowledge leadership. Mediated knowledge leadership refers to a transformation in how authority operates. In traditional literary systems, authority is distributed and dialogic. It emerges through interpretation, disagreement, and debate. In AI-mediated systems, though, authority increasingly lies on the capacity to organize, synthesize, and present meaning in ways that appear complete and coherent. And as a result, the processes through which meaning is constructed, debate, ambiguity, disagreement, all of these become less visible. What becomes visible instead is the final output. Authority is no longer located in the ability to interpret, but in the ability to deliver interpretation efficiently and convincingly. And this shift has particularly important consequences in the classroom, which brings me to pedagogy. Traditionally, literary education has been very process-oriented. Students are not simply taught what a text means, they are taught how to interpret it. They engage in close reading, they analyze form and tone, they construct arguments, and they revise those arguments in response to new insights. In this sense, the value of literary education lies not only in the meanings that are produced, but in the interpretive practices and activities that students develop. Students learn how to navigate ambiguity, how to evaluate competing interpretations, and how to support claims with textual evidence. This is what makes literary study a powerful site for cultivating critical thinking. AI changes this dynamic in a fundamental way. AI systems provide immediate structured interpretations that present meaning as coherent and complete. So instead of engaging in the process of interpretation, students can access the product of that process almost instantly. This creates a shift from interpretation as process to interpretation as product. In traditional pedagogy, the emphasis is on how meaning is produced. In AI-mediated environments, the emphasis shifts toward what the meaning is, the journey of interpretation, the movement through uncertainty, the weighing of possibilities, the construction of argument. All of that is compressed into a final answer, and this has important implications. When the process of reasoning is no longer visible, students may rely on externally generated interpretations rather than engaging in the cognitive work required to construct their own. The ability to question, critique, and reinterpret texts central to literary study can be diminished when meaning is encountered as already resolved. At the same time, this transformation changes the role of the educator. Traditionally, educators guide students through the interpretive exercise, but in AI-mediated environments, interpretation is already available, often in authoritative forms. So the role of the educator also shifts. Instead of simply guiding interpretation, educators are increasingly needing to help students critically engage with the conditions under which interpretation is produced. This includes questioning AI outputs, for example, understanding their limitations, and recognizing what is lost when interpretation becomes pre-structured. This is not an argument against AI, but we are looking at the shift from process to product. It introduces a tension between two modes of engagement, one that emphasizes interpretive effort and one that prioritizes efficiency and accessibility. And this tension forces us to reconsider a fundamental question. If literary education has historically been about cultivating interpretive capacity, what happens when interpretation itself becomes externalized? And this question becomes even more complex when we consider that not all literary traditions have the same access to interpretive resources, which brings me to the issue of uneven knowledge infrastructures. By this, I mean that the production and circulation of literary knowledge are shaped by differences in language, access, and the availability of interpretive resources. Not all literary traditions have the same level of infrastructure supporting interpretation. In English language, for example, literary contexts, interpretation, are supported by a dense and layered ecosystem. We have platforms like SparkNotes, CliffNotes, which provide structural pedagogical readings. We have extensive scholarly criticism available online where interpretations are debated, challenged, and revised. And we have digital archives, lectures, and publications that make these interpretations widely accessible. So when a reader approaches a text in English, they are not encountering it in isolation. They are encountering it alongside multiple interpretive frameworks. Meaning is produced within a rich, layered, and highly accessible system. Now, if we shift to a language like non-English language, such as Bengali, which is my native language, the situation looks quite different. Bengali literature has a rich and extensive critical tradition, but much of this work exists in print, in non-digitized archives, or within linguistic contexts that are not easily accessible to broader audiences. As a result, detailed single literary work analysis, especially in structured pedagogical formats, are often not available online. So in many cases, interpretation remains largely reader-driven. Readers engage directly with the text without the same level of structured interpretive support. This is not simply a matter of availability, it reflects epistemic inequality. The presence or absence of interpretive infrastructure shapes how literary knowledge is accessed and constructed. In English contexts, AI enters an already dense ecosystem of interpretation. It becomes one resource among many, but in contexts where interpretive infrastructures are limited or less accessible, AI can fill a structural gap. It can become not just a mediator, but sometimes it becomes the primary producer of accessible literary meaning. And it means that AI does not operate uniformly across languages. Its impact depend on the conditions into which it is introduced. In some contexts, it supplements existing authority. In others, it reshapes it more fundamentally. So to understand AI's role in literary studies, we cannot treat it as a neutral or universal tool. We have to see it as embedded within existing hierarchies of language, access, and knowledge production. And this becomes even more complex when we consider that even before AI, meaning was already being reshaped across languages through translation. So before we even bring AI into the picture, it's important to recognize something more fundamental, that literary meaning is already mediated. And one of the most important forms of this mediation is translation. In multilingual literary traditions, texts often move across languages, but translation is not simply a transfer of meaning from one language to another. It is an act of interpretation. It involves a series of decisions about tone, rhythm, cultural reference, and nuance that reshape how the text is experienced. So the translated text is not a neutral piece of the original. It is a reconstruction. It represents meaning as it has been rearticulated within a different linguistic and cultural framework. So I compare two pieces of literary work, one by Walt Whitman and another by Bengali Nobel laureate in literature, Rabindranath Tagore. Tagore's work exists in both Bengali and English, but this English translation is often described not as literal translation, but as transcreations, which means that texts reimagine the original rather than simply replicate it. In this process, elements such as tonal variation, cultural specificity, and linguistic texture are inevitably transformed. So when we read a translated text, we're already engaging with a version of the text that has been shaped by interpretive choices. Translation then introduces a first layer of mediation between text and reader. It does not diminish meaning, but it reshapes the conditions under which meaning is produced and understood. AI systems often operate on translated or standardized versions of texts, especially in multilingual contexts where original language resources may be less accessible. In doing so, they further organize and stabilize meaning. They tend to privilege clarity and coherence over ambiguity and variation. So what we begin to see is a sequence, the original text, the translation of it, and then the AI-generated interpretation. And at each stage, meaning is being shaped, structured, and in some cases, simplified. The cumulative effect is not just mediation, but a progressive stabilization of meaning as these layers accumulate. Ambiguity and nuance may be gradually reduced, not because they disappear from the text, but because they are filtered through successive interpretive frameworks. This is especially significant in contexts where original language materials and critical interpretations are less accessible. In such cases, translation and AI may function together as the primary mediators of literary knowledge to understand how these processes operate in practice. I now turn to comparative analysis of different modes of interpretation. To understand how AI reshapes interpretation in practice, I now turn to a comparative analysis. I compare three different modes of literary interpretations: pedagogical explanation, scholarly criticism, and AI-generated analysis. These are not just different types of explanations, they represent different levels within the hierarchy of literary knowledge production, and they perform different epistemic functions. So let me begin with the pedagogical interpretation, such as spark notes. Here, the goal is to facilitate understanding through structured explanation. For example, in readings of Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, the tone is described as exuberant, but this claim is not presented in isolation. It is constructed through a sequence of interpretive steps. The analysis draws attention to features such as long, expansive lines, catalogs of people and experiences, and rhetorical repetition like anaphora. These formal features are then connected to a broader idea, the speaker's expansive sense of connection to the universe. So here, we see that interpretation is visible. The reader can see how meaning is being constructed. Even though ambiguity is organized, it is not entirely eliminated. Now, if we move to scholarly criticism, the structure changes. Here I draw on the work of Mark Bauerlein. Bauerlein does not simply identify tone. Instead, he interrogates how Whitman's voice has been constructed within critical discourse. He focuses on what he calls Whitman's oratorical presence. And what he shows is that the voice is not stable. It oscillates between intimacy and public address. It raises questions about authority, audience, and the performance of the poetic self. So here, tone is not resolved. It becomes a site of tension and contradiction. Interpretation is not a product. It is an ongoing process of questioning and revising. So now when we turn to AI-generated interpretation, the structure shifts again. AI often identifies similar features, tone, themes, rhetorical devices, but it presents them very differently. And instead of showing how meaning is constructed, AI compresses the interpretive process into a single synthesized output. So tone might be described as expansive or optimistic. These are not necessarily incorrect, but they are presented as stable descriptors rather than as interpretive constructions. The reasoning is largely invisible. Alternative interpretations are not engaged with. Tensions within the text are not foregrounded. So if we compare these three modes, we see a clear structural difference. Pedagogical interpretation constructs meaning through guided reasoning. Scholarly criticism interrogates and destabilizes meaning through debate. And AI-generated interpretation stabilizes meaning through its systems, and it leads to a key finding. Interpretation is no longer something that unfolds, it is something that is delivered. So let me conclude by returning to the central argument of this paper. Artificial intelligence does not simply change how we read literature, it changes the conditions under which literary knowledge itself is produced, accessed, and understood. What emerges then is a fundamental transformation, what might be described as the collapse of interpretive layers. In traditional literary systems, interpretation unfolds across multiple levels. It is constructed, questioned, debated, and revised. In AI-mediated systems, these layers are increasingly compressed. Interpretation appears coherent, stable, and complete. The process of meaning-making becomes less visible, and the product becomes more dominant. We are also witnessing a rapid expansion of literary production. With generative AI, texts are being produced at unprecedented speed and scale. Writing, translation, and publishing are becoming faster, more accessible, and more automated. AI is therefore not only shaping how texts are read, it is also reshaping how they are created. This does not eliminate interpretation, but it fundamentally transforms the conditions under which interpretation occurs. And this brings me to my final question. If literature depends on ambiguity, multiplicity, and interpretive effort, what happens when meaning becomes complete, certain? Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.